Andrew Wilson, welcome to Apollo's Water.
Thank you very much for having me, Travis Fleming. Very nice to be with you.
I don't think I've had anybody actually say my name.
There's just something delightfully emphatic about an invitation like that. So I thought I've got to rise to it.
Okay, this is going to be fun. I can tell. Are you ready for the Fast Five?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. You interact with Americans quite a bit, but the thing that you don't get about Americans is what?
Why they are so prone to arrest me.
What?
I've been in trouble with the law 3 times in my life, and all 3 of them have been in America, and I've spent about 12 to 14 weeks in America in my, maybe a little more, maybe about 4 or 5 months out of my 45 years, and all 3 times have been in America.
So and you've been arrested 3 times?
I haven't been arrested, but I've been stopped by the police. Our car was flagged down. I was told to leave Harlem because I was overdressed. I've been stopped on the open road driving at 30 miles an hour in the countryside in Maryland. And some people at actually your local airport where you came from in Chicago got very angry with me for not having filled out a green card to say my 9-month-old was not involved in the Holocaust. And those kinds of things are always what baffle me about American bureau. I imagine the same is true when people are in for America arrive in Britain, but I never experienced that. So.
Okay, well, how about this one then? The thing Americans don't get about Brits is what?
Cricket.
Oh, that's true. That's true. That is true. I still don't get cricket, but I'd love to learn. I mean, it's fascinating to me that, like,
game.
Is it the second most popular sport on the planet, or first?
Do you know what? Football must be more popular, but because cricket's so big in India and the subcontinent, I imagine cricket might be second. I don't actually know, but football will be more.
Yeah, I would think so, but I still got to figure out cricket. Okay, how about this one? Since you are a historian, if you could interview anyone from history outside of the biblical timeline, who would it be and why?
It's just a boring answer as an English guy, but probably Churchill. I just find him, Churchill or Martin Luther, both actually for the same kind of reason, because I think they're very impressively courageous and prickly but brilliant people who are also very funny. And I think it would be a really interesting. I think they're both the kind of guys you'd want to have a beer with. That kind of interview. Yeah.
I actually would love to see them meet each other historically. Now that would have been a really funny conversation.
Yeah, it would.
All right, here we go. Number 4, the one habit that I have that annoys my wife and kids is what?
I embarrass them. I'm quite a loud person, and I'm quite, they're all 4 of them, my wife and my 3 kids. My daughter wouldn't articulate it that way, but certainly the boys and Rachel would say, yes, I'm embarrassing, I think.
You have to elaborate on that, because I don't think that's an annoying habit at all. I think that's a wonderful
thing. The annoying habit is stubbing my toe. I think I stub my toe a lot, and I stop, drop, and roll. Lots of noise, lots of fanfare. And they would all find that excruciating in different ways.
All right, number 5. If I could be any British dish and like try to show that to the world to explain who I am, what would that be and why?
As in food, you mean?
Yeah, food.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an Indian dish. I think a lamb madras or a chicken tikka masala, but probably a curry. Like, I think people, there's a stereotype of what English people eat and what a lot of English people actually eat now as a result of, we have just Indian, and this is also, by the way, something that I don't understand about America. Just the lack of Indian food in America, or just it's just, of course, in Britain we've got lots of people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh who live here, and the food is just amazing. Whereas you guys do Mexican instead. I suppose that's the equivalent.
That's true. It all depends on where you live, I suppose. But we don't have as large as an Indian population as you do, although we have a very large Indian population. I mean, we do. It's one of the fastest growing groups, and they are the highest income earning ethnic group in the United States. Okay. We've actually done an episode on that, on the Indian diaspora, interestingly enough. So that's kind of fun. That's why we talk about that. Anyway, we have the full thing here. We have everything. This is the one-stop shop for theology and ministry. But speaking of that, that's what your book is, by the way. It is Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. I mean, what in the world? Like, I saw this and I went, oh no, is this a man who is mad about that little skirmish between our nations and he had to put 1776 as bad? because most Americans go 1776. I mean, this is, you are questioning something for an American that seems to be very, very, I mean, sacrosanct. You don't question that. And yet you have laid that out, not just in America, of course, but across Europe, to say that really is a pivotal moment, a pivotal year that has, I mean, ramifications until now. Why 1776? I know this is huge because I've read your book, but there's so many different pieces in it. But what made you think 1776?
Well, so the reason is because there are a bunch of huge factors, forces, transformations which have made modernity, or made the world of what I call the post-Christian West, and they examples like the Enlightenment or industrialization, economic growth, democratic government, a kind of post-Christian vision of morality, ethics, and metaphysics, globalization, and romanticism, and they're the sort of 7 different developments that I would highlight and say these 7 forces basically have made the kind of world we are, and so even the changes we've seen in the last 7 to 10 years, which have made people go, what on earth's going on here, are products of those different forces. And that's effectively half of what I'm trying to do with the book, is to say that's the world we're in, and the other half is to say the story as to why we're like that can be told I hope in a really nice, fun, compelling way through the story of this one year, because 1776 is not just, in fact, I don't think most of the book is not about America at all.
Right.
So if you said to an American, of course, they would all say, well, this is the specific of the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. But if you looked at what was going on in Europe at the time, in France or in Italy or in Germany or in England or Scotland, and actually even I've got a chapter in the book that's mainly set in the South Pacific, and what's going on elsewhere in India, what's going on elsewhere in the world, you'd say that the economic and philosophical and artistic, even musical, the transformations taking place in and through Romanticism. And certainly if you go to a French cafe or a German theatre or an English factory or a Scottish pub, you'd find these enormously important developments taking place through names that might well be familiar to American listeners, Voltaire or Diderot or Casanova or Rousseau or David Hume or Immanuel Kant or Edward Gibbon. So people, these giants who are all writing and doing impressive and important things in this year, at the same time, of course, and often quite unaware of what's going on in America, because news takes 3 months to cross the Atlantic. So they don't know, they're not responding to those developments as such. Often some of them are, but many of them are not. So it's a really great way of telling a story about how modernity came to be and why the Christian West, post-Christian West, is like it is, and then how the church can respond to it. So that's why that year, it's just a great year for an intense, take on the story of how we got as we are.
I was amazed at how many different regions that you hit, even when you started off with maps and you started going around the world saying, basically, it's not that one group was smarter than the other. You talk about resources and how each one of those was growing.
Yeah.
I was amazed at just the whole breadth of the book and the width and breadth. You had so many different resources. You had so many different pieces of history you were playing. I mean, you're right. The American part, I laughed in jest just because 1776 is such a big deal for us. I mean, and you do reference Paine and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton, but they are themselves products of the Enlightenment itself, in this whole period.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Paine's obviously British. I mean, he comes from a few miles from my house. Like there's pubs in, if you ever go to the town of Lewis, it's a few miles from where I'm sitting now in Sussex, and the Rights of Man pub and Tom Paine, this and that. I mean, and so they are connected. And obviously what's happening in America is partly a product of developments that are taking place in Europe intellectually and politically, for obvious reasons. And there is a feedback loop as well. So some of the stuff that's going on in Romanticism, the early or proto-Romanticism, really, the play Sturm und Drang, which sets up Romanticism in many ways, and that movement around Goethe, but the play is set in the American Revolutionary War. So there's a fusion, there's a sort of two-way exchange. Franklin rocks up in Paris at the end of the year and is connected with a lot of the characters I touched on. So I wouldn't want to imply they're operating completely distinctly from each other. But yeah, the world's a big place, and it's not anything like as connected as it is now. So you can tell a really interesting story about the development of the modern world through looking at what's happening in Indian cloth in 1776, or what's happening in German theatre, or what's happening, whatever. So and there's lots of parts of the world. I'd love to have gone more into Russia, because it's a fascinating period in the development of the Russian state, but you just have to put a lid on it eventually. And I concluded that I couldn't fit that in. But yeah, I just think it's a fascinating year that opens up all kinds of interesting dimensions to the way we became like we are.
What was incredible to me was the amount of characters that you brought in that were known, and then you evaluated by bringing in their bios. And really, you would think that these were just on the dustbin of history, but no, these are very living characters that you find that they're not so far removed from where we're at now, where we're talking about the Marquis de Sade, where you're talking about Casanova, their love lives,
Yeah.
the scandals that were involved. This wasn't anything new. But what I really appreciated is when you talk about it being a weirder, like this is how we got weirder. And I love the fact that you use that acronym. I'd seen the weird. I remember talking with Glenn Scrivener about this. He was talking about how Glenn was just awesome. But when I went, okay, weird. And then you put weirder. And I went, wait a minute. So define that for us, what you mean by weirder, this acronym and what it stands for. You've already alluded to it, but go ahead.
Yeah.
And
So,
talk about that a bit again.
So weird I've got from Joseph Henrich and then Jonathan Haidt is where I first encountered it, which stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, to which I've added ex-Christian and Romantic, because those are more ideological, moral, ethical components of it. They're sort of more to do with the realm of ideas rather than the realm of institutions and material factors, which is what Haidt and Henrich and others are talking about. And so, yeah, I use that as a 7-word acronym, it's a 7-letter acronym to summarize those 7 developments that I mentioned earlier.
So we've seen Western, educated, as you said, industrialized. We understand the democratic. I mean, but what got me though was the ex-Christian part. That one I wasn't anticipating to see within this book, because at that time I would think, I mean, you've proven the otherwise, but I would think that there was a lot of Christians that were there at that time. And it was a huge movement of faith across the board. And it was. I mean, we know about the Wesleys and the Whitfields and that kind of thing. But what made you go, hey, ex-Christian? This actually, it's been set up to be ex-Christian all the way back in the 1700s to now. I mean, what really brought that to the surface?
That's interesting. That might be the idea that has got the deepest roots for me. I haven't been asked that before. I think that it came originally from reading a book by Alistair McGrath about 20 years ago called The Twilight of Atheism, in which had nothing to do with my research. I wasn't researching this, but I haven't even thought about this book for a long time after that. But he wrote basically a book saying that the late 18th century and the French Revolution in particular marked the high noon of modern atheism, and what we're now seeing is the twilight. And I think you could engage with that and push back in various ways, but it was a fascinating case from obviously a brilliant intellectual historian and theologian who made the case, effectively introduced me to, I'd not really read much of the French, particularly in France, the French atheists and at the time, and the people who were both the sort of anti-Christian brigades, like Voltaire, who's not an atheist at all. Voltaire thinks we should believe it. He famously said, if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. So he's not an atheist at all, but he really hates the Catholic Church. And is trying to destroy it. And then you have proper, more like what we would call thoroughgoing atheists. We have people like Sade, as you mentioned, people like Diderot, Baron d'Holbach, and then people who don't quite say I'm an atheist, but they're making very anti-critical of Christianity arguments. People like David Hume, and actually in their own ways, Tom Paine and Jefferson and others. And they're all around at this point. And this is probably the most intellectually stimulating. If you wanted to be an atheist at any period in history, or wanted to be somebody who was opposing Christianity and say, when did it feel like we were sweeping all before us? You'd probably pick maybe 1770s or probably even more 1780s or early 1790s, before the terror kicked in and everything unspooled in France. And so that's probably maybe the idea I had earliest. I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago before working on this, where do you think the world's move towards a post-Christian way of thinking took its biggest steps forward, I'd probably say towards the later period of the European Enlightenment in around the 1770s and 80s. And I still think that. Now, obviously, I then tell the story by trying to bring in the French side, which is very significant. In some ways, the three most important figures there are the ones I mentioned, Sade, Voltaire, and Diderot, in different ways. But I also tell the American story through that edit to the Declaration, and not just that edit. That edit's more a parable, really, than a kind of argument for why it happened. But you do have a very significant development in America, even that it sits in between the first and second Great Awakenings. But you also have quite a strong, not that Christian impetus to a whole bunch of things in American life as well. And then I'll even get on to Tocqueville towards the end. So this is just a fascinating. Tocqueville has really surprised me. It's like these people are very Christian and very, what I would call pagan. They've got a very pagan flavor to the things that they pursue. So, and he's trying to make sense of it. He can't quite work out how America is so Christian and yet so obsessed with this worldly material prosperity at the same time, which of course is something that as a non-American is still very striking about America now. The religiosity mingled with the sort of very material, looking for present prosperity and experience and the pursuit of happiness. And that, I think, for many people in the world, is like, America is very unusual in that way. And so I think there is a bit of that on your side of the Atlantic as well, but more of it is driven by what's happening intellectually in Europe and particularly in France.
And you called it the what? Protestant paganism? Isn't that the terminology that you use? And I went, oh, that'll preach.
Well, will it? Who knows? I like that because that's really me trying to do an intellectual genealogy of modern post-Christianity to try and synthesize there's a Catholic account which I think has got a lot of truth to it, but is certainly very overstated in some settings, which is that really the reason you have modern secularism is because of Protestantism and the divisions in Christendom it brought about. But then there's another telling of the story, which is actually there's a low-level paganism that to some degree has always been here that rose up again in the Enlightenment. And I think both of those stories have a lot of merit. But I think it's actually the synthesis of the two, the sort of almost like a reaction between two elements that come together and then are catalyzed by industrialization and enrichment in particular, that cause this to the way that, but of course that idea, that Protestant paganism, doesn't trickle down into the experience of many in the West until midway through the 20th century for many. That's where post-Christianity begins. And in your country, really, a lot of that is really kicking in the last 10 years or so. Like, it's fascinating that what's happened it's taken 80 years in Europe, it's taken 8 years in America. But even in the 90s, you would look at America and say, wow, this is incredibly religious compared to all other countries that are as wealthy as North America, which had lots of people writing books as to why. But I think in the end, that those two forces, Protestantism and paganism, have collided and generated what we see. But it just is the ripples take a long time to permeate through the whole of society.
When you mentioned that it took when you mentioned that it took 80 years in the UK and it took 8 years here, and it's very religious, I know that our audience is probably trying to keep up right now with what we're talking about here, because we're going fast. I mean, this is stuff where, as someone said, I believe it's called the curse of knowledge. You know everything about it. You think everybody else does too. I know I do all the time. No. There's nothing to be apologetic about. It's just I get caught because I want to talk about this stuff. This stuff is so amazing to me when you get into the intellectual history of anything. But I do know sometimes we have to be able to anchor this for our people to them to understand, or just grab a hold of, because it is so fast, and not everyone's thinking about this all the time. But when you're talking about that, and you mentioned how it's caught up, what do you mean by that? It's caught up, or it took 8 years in America, and we're seeing that now. We're seeing this post-Christianity take effect now, or the materialism and people, the real values of what they believe, where they're pulling away from church, and they still have this kind of laissez-faire belief, even though it has no really major effect on their life, and their real kind of Newbegin's term, gods and goddesses, would be the materialism of the age. Is that what you would say, or is there something else in there?
Yeah, I think I would. I think it's a slightly flippant way of saying something that's much more complicated than that. And obviously, I've written a book about it, and so you're right, trying to summarize that quickly is often you can just jump over a lot of things. But I think what I mean by the 80 and 8 is that a lot of my American friends in places, when I go, I'm going in a couple of days' time, I'll be heading to the States and talking about some of these things. And I find that a lot of people are saying that it feels to a lot of Americans as if this has come out of nowhere. And by which I mean a combination of people leaving the church, but also, and often primarily, the canary in the coal mine was the beginnings of quite seismic cultural and moral changes in the nation, which seem to a lot of people, particularly in certain parts of America, it's probably less true if you live in New York or San Francisco, which are more like Europe in that sense. But to a lot of the states, it feels like, well, this is almost coming out of nowhere, like the very, very sudden movement from, what I believed was quite respectable 20 years ago, and now it is absolutely beyond the pale, like that kind of change. Whereas in Britain and most of Europe, not all of Europe, but that process has just taken a lot longer, both in terms of de-churching, which a couple of friends of mine have written a book about recently, just in the American context, and you might have seen it. But also in terms of the marginalization of what people, certainly a lot of, if I just sort of say middle of the road white evangelicals. I think if you're in the black church, you probably don't see it this way at all. You say, no, many of these developments have been helpful in lots of ways. There's other developments been much more positive. But in the white church, people go, this was what I believed was fine 20 years ago. Now it's not. Whereas in Europe, that's just taken 80 years because it really kicked in at this, towards the end of, we had a sort of a spike of religiosity just after World War II. But really from the sort of late 50s, early 60s, the influence of Christianity in the culture sphere has been quite a gradual decline. John Robinson wrote Honest to God in sort of whatever that was, late 50s, maybe early 1960s, 1962, that kind of thing. And it's really been sort of on the way since then, and accompanied with social, sexual mores transforming. And so actually in Britain, it probably doesn't feel so disorienting for people because it's been a much slower burn. Whereas I think in America was much more religious than Britain, or felt like it was in 1998, and now feels like it's almost less so in much of the nation than Britain. And that change has obviously taken a lot of people by surprise because of the speed. But I think in the end, it is the same transition taking place, sadly. And I think there's something for each of us to learn from the other about how that works. Yeah.
One of the things that I encounter all the time is, okay, so what? You've shown us this. What do we do with it? Now that we know this development, and to me, you have to understand how something develops before you can help orchestrate any type of, you need to understand how people think in order before you can try to change their mind and influence them and help them to see Christ. And being a pastor and a historian, which is a very unique combination, sometimes those two don't lend itself to one another. I mean, we hope we can have research and we have time and we're trying to be dads and we're trying to lead a church and we're trying to research. What has the book done for you in researching the book and helping you communicate to your people how to follow Christ in this moment in time?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And to be honest, for me, it's almost the process has been the other way around, that the book has grown out of trying to help think through apologetics and how to reach people in London and how to help the church live in a very secular city, which has then percolated into ideas about how I might write and equip people in a book form. So it's not so much I'd researched the book and then thought, how does this affect preaching? But rather the other way around. Like I'm having to preach on this stuff all the time and think through trends in culture and then go, oh, this is actually might be a helpful way of expressing this for others. But there's obviously a correspondence between the two. I think my church in particular, and it's perhaps hinted at by something I said a moment ago about the black church in America. My church, I'm a pastor in a black majority church in South London, where the history of the history of Christianity in the West has a very different tenor and flavor and resonances to many of the people in our church than it would to many white people listening to it. Certainly white people in North America, for whom America has, as I said, was much more religious more recently. So the combination of the pace of secularization in the two nations and the specific experience of most people in my church, to be honest, has meant that the way of telling that history has obviously been quite shaped by, and I've been very informed by, trying to tell the story of the West in a way that both honors some really good things and obviously calls out some really bad things, which of course we're always trying to do, because you want to have an appropriate level of humility and yet celebration and gratitude. But I think that what that's meant is that history's become more important to me, partly by being a pastor in a black majority church, because I can't take for granted that my way of just assume we all have a functioning history of the recent West. It's just that we may not critique it very much or think it through someone else's eyes very much. And I haven't had that luxury because of the ministry context I'm in. So I'm regularly thinking, wow, I've actually got not two stories to integrate here, but three. I've got the way that me as a sort of white evangelical boy brought up on isn't it wonderful what Wilberforce did and what Wesley did kind of story, mingled with a secular story, which is Christianity's bigoted and repressive, but mingled with a black Christian story and a more, or many other people from other parts of the world in the former British Empire, whose story would be a very nuanced combination of both of those. They say, well, we're grateful for this, but this was really bad, and that was it. And so probably integrating those three stories has both shaped and been shaped by the project I've worked on. And I suspect had I not had that experience in pastoral ministry, I might not have wanted to write a history book. So, but I haven't actually thought that until we're having this conversation, because I don't think I'd realized the connection in the way I'm expressing it now. But I think that's probably where the motive comes from.
Well, I think I mean, you and I both pastored churches where there was a large group of different ethnicities than ourselves. You said black majority for yourself. I know I had just a myriad of different nations in two of my ministries. And I remember Newbegin talking about one of the essential ingredients for a missionary encounter is the non-Western church speaking to the Western church, because those global voices perspective enables us to see it through different lenses than we can see in our own. What have you, I mean, you've already alluded to the fact that you've seen through their eyes that the history had some good and some bad. We often think, like you said before, it's good, or even going back in time, oh, the good old days. Well, if you were African American or you were a woman, you know, it wasn't it wasn't always a good history. So there have been great advances, but yet implicit within Western civilization, while we are beneficiaries of it, are some huge negatives, as you've alluded to. What have those done to act as blind spots for the reality and the validity of the gospel in our moment?
What are the things that the church has got wrong make it much harder for people to believe the gospel now?
Oh, yeah, we lost a credibility problem.
Yeah,
an authority
yeah.
problem.
Yes. So, I mean, there are some very obvious ones. In you wouldn't need me, and don't want an English guy's not going to give you a lecture about slavery or anything like that. But that obviously is a big factor in Britain, and even a lot of the colonial legacy that didn't necessarily involve enslavement, and a lot which I talk about in the book, that actually even when it looked ostensibly like we were sort of trading or whatever, we set up under the auspices of saying we're just trading, but actually it's very, very exploitative. I remember seeing people crying about giving Hong Kong back to China in 1997. And obviously that's been very complex, and a lot of people from Hong Kong come into my nation in the last 2 years as a result of what's happened there. But that, of course, has a history going back to the 1840s of British gunships just sailing up and saying, right, okay, we're going to force you to trade with us and we're going to take this stuff in. So lots of that stuff around the world. But in our own nation, I think it compromised our, much of the church's moral authority. I don't think I don't think that the church is uniquely responsible for those things at all. In fact, often to the extent that there was anybody critiquing and objecting to what the empire was doing in my country, that was coming from a section of the evangelical church, or it was robust critique, and of course, increasingly as the time went on, from people, formerly enslaved people, who were critiquing. So that a lot of that I talk a lot in the book about Olaudah Equiano, who's an absolute hero, and obviously and white believers as well. So there's lots of that coming from the critics. So I don't blame the church for all of the sins of empire, and I don't blame empire for all the problems the world faces today. But clearly, that has created a significant credibility problem for the church now, even sometimes in areas where it didn't create the same problem 150 years ago, which is strange, but that's how these things have played out historically. And I think it's just to expose the reality that, well, I quote, as many people do, Upton Sinclair, it's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon him not understanding it. And that's not only true of people who were not believers, it's true of Christians as well. I think the church did a huge amount of good in the period I'm writing about, and still does, of course. That's why I'm a pastor. But I think you just have to own these are the ways in which it was very ambiguous and complex, and particularly when the church or individuals in the church have nearly untrammeled power, the level of trust you can place on individuals to do the godly thing diminishes the extent to which those accountability structures are removed. And I think that's what we are seeing now in a lot of what's shaking through the church in abusive leadership. It's what we saw in the 1840s or the 1770s or whatever, many, many other periods. And so I think it's not to say, oh no, the church is no better than anyone else. I think it's just to say, no, the church, individuals who follow Jesus still need the same protections from their own sin and accountability structures to prevent them from exploiting other people, and that's not something you're immune to just because you are a Christian. And I think that's as I say, we're seeing that in our own day just as well. And so for me, one of the benefits of a book like this to say, wow, people who love the Lord and are brilliant on this issue have massive blind spots here, and of course we still do. And I think sadly we're seeing much of the impact of that in our own day.
We are seeing the impact of that in our day. I know I had as a guest not too long ago Russell Moore, a theologian in America, writing about the losing our religion, and we talked about we have a credibility crisis. We have, I mean, there's so many different areas that he named, And that's true. I mean, we can see this across the board. We can see where the culture's at. We can see the arguments. We experience the conversations, the lack of trust, the labels. I was surprised at how much of that was also going on in the 1700s. That was a shock to me. I thought it was more of a recent development, and it wasn't. There were people at the time, as you said before, that were standing up against slavery, that were standing and against hypocrisy, that were going through all these different pieces, and that were, even in the colonialization aspect, were appalled at some of the exploitation that was going on, as you alluded to, missionaries and priests calling for that. I do know, in talking to a lot of different people, as we're assessing where the modern era is right now, some are saying, okay, I got it. We've got all these historical issues. We've got systemic issues that have gone on. But where is there hope? Where can we see the church doing good? And you said, I wouldn't be a pastor if we weren't doing good. Where do you see the hope now, as we've identified some of these issues historically? We can't change the past. So how do we go about living in the present? And where do you see hope now, where people are actually doing good in a way to build credibility as a bridge for the gospel?
So I think I go, that the beautiful, one of the songs of ascents has this lovely line where it says, I don't want to concern myself, oh Lord, with things that are too wonderful for me. I've just quieted my soul like a weaned child with his mother. And I think sometimes when you see, we all pride ourselves on seeing the big picture. And obviously this is silly coming from me, because I've written a book with a very, very big picture. The world in the last 200 years. But actually, I think that because you're drawing with such broad brushstrokes, and you are aware of such titanically significant individuals for good and evil and both, it can be quite easy, I think, to lose just what's happening in your street or your home or your church. And I think when I look for hope, actually that's where I go. So I don't disregard the big things. I don't regard, I know. So I have this a lot, I'm probably mid-40s, have been in some sort of Christian ministry for nearly 20 years, and therefore I've now got contemporaries of mine and people who I know quite well who have gone into ministry, led well, and then done something stupid, or maybe even worse, evil, and therefore been either removed or fallen or whatever. And so when I look at that landscape, I think, oh gosh, what's going on? It's just dropping like flies. And then I look at my church, or even better, a small group, like not even the whole church. Our church is 1,500 people, but you got to, okay, so if instead of zooming into you right now, I was zooming into a small group happening in my church tonight, there's a bunch of, I might say, oh, there's a few older women who are meeting up, or there's just a bunch of our, people who are working in the ministry to the poor area who are just meeting up to have a small group, or there's a bunch of the kids workers getting together, or just a random selection of people in our church, and was to just listen in and hear what they were talking about, and listen to them, pray with them, and listen to their priorities and their hopes and the way that they are looking for God to help them as they raise their kids, or go to work, or just deal with difficult, a difficult boss is giving them a hard time and they're not quite sure what's a godly way of responding to it, or advocate for justice in this area, or serve the poor. And you think that's where I get hope. So is when I sort of go very small. It's a bit like when those tweets every now and then someone says something silly about pro-lifers and goes, oh, pro-lifers just care about the issue, but why don't they just adopt some kids? And then there's this whole mass, hundreds and hundreds of responses underneath going, well, I do this, and I've seen a number of those do the rounds. There's another one a few weeks ago, and just the thousands upon thousands of Christian families who are going, yeah, I'm looking after a special needs child, or I'm adopting this, or that's how I am doing. I'm wanting to see the kingdom is like yeast. It's hidden in a loaf. Most people don't see it, grow very gradually. So I think hope comes there as I look small, and God has chosen the weak things in the world to shame the strong. And I think sometimes when you spend too much on our celebrity inclined culture, our mass media culture, the speed of social media, all those things draw our eyes to the new and impressive and dramatic. And then we're like, oh man, all my hopes were pinned on this guy, or it often is a guy, it often might be a woman, being the new big thing. A friend of mine rang me yesterday. I don't know whether this is just kind of share. I'm an external processor. It might be stupid, but he rang me yesterday and he'd seen the article written about me and Rachel and the Gospel Coalition. He knew I'm going to this event next week to preach there, and he's a fellow pastor, but we've been friends for 20 years. And he just rang me up and he said, I just want to give you a warning. Like, just don't believe the PR. And he actually, this would be facetious, but you would hear it, I think, in the spirit he meant it. Americans love a celebrity. Just don't be that. You just mustn't believe it. And it was so good, and it was very warm and not intense and heavy, and he loves me, and I love him. But it's like this. You got to keep things small and not. Now that doesn't mean I lead a large church and I want my book to be read by lots of people, and I'm happy to speak at big conferences. So I don't despise those things either, but I think when I look at the big, I go, oh, there's so much scope for disappointment. And when I look very small, what's happening in your street or your home or your meal table or your small group, then there's a lot of reasons to see, wow, look what God's doing with people you've never heard of.
That's an encouraging word, especially in our moment right now. I think you're right. Americans, especially, do Brits not love the celebrity as much?
And this is why I said hear it in the spirits. And I think we do too. I don't think we're any better than anyone else. But I do think that probably the celebrity culture in the church is a much bigger risk in America. In Britain, the only reason we don't have a celebrity culture, not because we're more humble than anyone, it's just because there's not enough Christians or money to make it feel like a celebrity. You know what I mean? It's that rather than that we're somehow more pious. I don't think we are.
What do you think culturally, as you said, you're leading a church, which you said 1,500 people. That's quite large.
I don't lead the
the
church,
UK.
actually, no. And this is one of the reasons I have time to write a book like this. I'm called the teaching pastor, but the senior pastor is a friend of mine. We have a big staff team, and so I do more preaching, but I don't lead the church.
But I mean, even then, writing helping to be on the leadership team, to develop sermons and write a book. I mean, how long did it take you to write this book?
Well, so 3 years from the start of the project to publishing it, 2 years of pretty intense work. But then it would have taken longer, but that was the only benefit. I hated lockdown. I'm not a fan of lockdowns at all. They were pretty long in Britain. But that was probably for me, the silver lining was that I think lots of things I would otherwise have had to do, I just couldn't. And a lot of the time I couldn't even barely leave my house. I was sitting in the room I'm sitting in now, surrounded by books that are all around me as I'm speaking. And there are lots of the ministry things I would like to do, including driving up to London or whatever. I just couldn't do. So probably, 2 years, but I think it would have been 3 or 4 years if it hadn't been for the lockdown.
What's been the response of the book so far?
Yeah, I've been really encouraged. I mean, this has only been out, I don't know, what is it? Officially 2 weeks, I think. I'm very encouraged. I think probably I've written enough books to know that the initial responses you get are often the positive ones, because people who are very enthusiastic about the book and are likely to like it have often ordered it online, and before they've heard about it, they want to talk about it, and then they buy it and quickly read it and say, I love this book. So that's not necessarily representative of everything, but I have been really encouraged, particularly in the States. I think that the sales will be dramatically more in the States than they are in Britain. I don't know what they'll end up. But also, I think the feedback, I think the kind of questions you're asking are reflective of they demonstrate, I think, the extent to which that the things I'm talking about are hopefully answers to questions that Americans are asking more than they are to questions British people are asking, which is partly to do with the history of the year, but it's partly also to do with the discussion we had earlier about the pace of change. And I think that probably the appreciation of and the need for integrated history in the American setting. So I think it's in Britain. I think plenty of people have gone, I'm really glad it's come out. I've heard good things about it. I haven't got around to it. Whereas in America, I think there's more of this is one of there's lots of others, but this is one of those books I'm hoping is going to really help me make sense of our cultural moment. And I'm really grateful for the response that it has had. And really stimulating discussions like this make me feel like, okay, I think there is a place for this. It's found a voice in the market out there, but yeah, we will see. It's probably much too soon to say.
Well, I was chatting with Mark Knoll, and we were just talking about books on the horizon, and he made sure to highlight your book. So he was
very kind about it, and that was a massive encouragement, because obviously I have a huge respect for him. But I think we will see. But I'd love it to spark some discussions and some debates, which perhaps I can't even foresee what they would be. But help people think, and I also want it to be really fun to read. Because I just think it's a good story. I think it's just the kind of thing that even if you weren't particularly going to take application, you might go, that was really interesting to hear about those things, because these characters are fascinating and what they did really matters.
Well, how you brought out different stories. I mean, even as you talked about the Endeavor and uniting that to the space shuttle, or how you bring out different people with even Mary Shelley and talking about the original title of her book. And then, I mean, you have this way of bringing out the punchline. And I started figuring that out as I went. I'm like, okay, he's going to introduce something here. Here's the punchline. I'm like, okay, who is this? And but you brought life to a lot of different characters that I would have considered not together. I mean, they were really disparate across the board, but you brought them together in ways that it was a cohesive whole to see how this mentality wasn't just with one person. There's several different people that are doing different events at the same time that have all trickled down to this current moment. And it's causing us to go, wait a minute, how do we refigure this? How do we notice this? Because I know when we talk to people, and our focus is on helping people with their missionary encounter with Western culture, they want to say, well, what's bad? Western culture has done all these good things, and it has. There's great advances medically, technologically,
Oh,
educationally.
absolutely. Yeah.
All of those things are wonderful, wonderful things. But one of the things that we've noticed, and I've talked to this to several people, is when we talk about going on mission, or we go to a mission trip, let's say, we'll talk all the time about going to Haiti or Guatemala or Uganda, places that are predominantly Christian, but we don't go to Japan, which is, predominantly not one of the most unreached countries in the world. It's because we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
We don't know what to bring because we've so equated modernity in the Western culture really with Christianity that we don't know how to separate them. We don't know how to make it understandable.
Insightful.
It is making it very, very difficult, but it's good to untangle this. And it makes me stop and go, as you're interacting with people from the non-Western world that have living now in the Western culture, and maybe for a couple of generations, just with the rise of, the British Empire, and it's the sun never sets on it, of course. And I remember hearing Ray Bakke, who was an urban missiologist years ago, and he was talking about how many different people from the British Empire were moving back into London. And he said not too many of the white Londoners, this is, as he was writing, this is in the late 90s, he said, don't like that. And he goes, well, I call this the Empire Strikes Back syndrome.
Yeah.
But you're seeing just a shift culturally across the board. It's not just happening in the UK. We're seeing with the world refugee crisis, we're seeing more people move. God is doing something that's absolutely incredible, but still in the backdrop, and everyone wants, in many respects, is the Western cultural ideal. They want that prosperous life. They want that comfortability, but with that comes its own form of idolatry. And how do we root that out when it's part and parcel of every single one of us? And how does the Christian message really take root, and can we separate them? Those are the questions. And you've brought a lot of those to the surface and contributed your voice to the conversation to help us to be able to untangle many of these different pieces. And it's been thoroughly enjoyable.
I think that's the hope, is that by I'm not sort of hand-wringing oh gosh, everything that my ancestors did is terrible. That's not my disposition at all. I'm an optimistic person, but I think it's also very important to tell history humbly. And there is definitely a very simplistic triumphalist reading of it, just as there is an apocalyptically gloom-mongery kind of reading as well. And I think by telling hopefully a rounded and integrated story from lots of different angles, you can say even industrialization, you can say it's really good here and here, it's had really bad here and here. Weighing up the pros and cons is just, we can't extricate ourselves from it. I don't think we could go back even if we wanted to, but we've got to just be honest about some of those tensions. The same is true of the amount of wealth we have now. The same is true of the history of European thought, or globalization. I think has been very damaging in a lot of areas, but it's also been made a lot of people live longer and more comfortably. And it's very difficult to appraise those things in the balance. But I think by talking about what they are, and not just the sort of pros and cons of these massive developments, but also the pros and cons, the blind spots, but also strengths of specific individuals, you can then have a sort of slightly more, a humble courage. And that's what I would look for, is for people to say, I can be bold because of what God has done, but I need to be humble because I know the mistakes that people have made, even when God is with them, and to try and pursue both of those threads together. And I think that's very important. And yes, if the book kind of either models that or just sort of expresses it in a way, I'd be really happy. That's what I'm hoping.
It's funny, as I was chatting with Malcolm Guy several months ago, we were talking about the state of Christianity in the UK. And it was St. Patrick's Day when we were having this conversation. So he had a pipe in one hand and a pint in the other. And as he was talking, he made a comment. He said, well, we're going to be all right. Lord got down to 11 disciples. We'll be okay. If we get down to the 11 last Christians, God, we don't need to wring our hands. I think part of the reason is that there's been a loss of cultural familiarity and power within that, as well as cultural capital that has been lost, that is no longer there. And I think we have to rethink and understand what power we are looking for. What are we trying to do to communicate and transmit the gospel in an effective manner so that people might be participants and understand who Jesus is, but to see themselves within the kingdom and how to flourish in the middle of that.
Yeah.
One of the things that we like to do is we get ready to conclude our show for today. I know you have a hard stop here in a few moments, but we like to, because we are Apollos watered, we want to water faith. We like to leave people with a water bottle for the week, something for them to sip on. What is one truth that we can take away from your book that our people can sip on this week?
That's a very good question. I hope there's a bunch, but I think the one that I actually kind of finished the book with, I think, is the fact that a lot of the things, the truth is, in a way, that the truth people want to believe in order to ground their confidence in human rights and human dignity and lots of really good things in this world, that truth ultimately only holds on the basis of Christianity. That there is something deeply good about what the Christian message brings to the world in terms of our understanding of who humans are and how we should treat one another. And that even people who strongly object to Christianity require Christianity to make the critique of it that they are making. And the things that seem to us self-evident truths, or the UN Declaration on Human Rights, or, you know, we should love one another, you think that is what, in a really good way, everyone you know, almost everyone you know, I would think, believes that that is a moral absolute. Loving one another, treating others as you wish to be treated yourself. You think those things, they're not just said by Jesus, although of course they are, but they are only a logical, existentially satisfying thing to believe and pursue on the basis of Christian truth. It doesn't make sense if you hold to an atheist, materialist, exclusively evolutionist account of the world in which we started as goo and now we're this. And actually, there's no reason to ground. You should love one another. You should include people who are not like you. You should pursue diversity. You should be kind. But all of those things that people rightly prize in our world, they're actually only things that the only moral basis, the only philosophically reasonable basis for saying you should do them is that God, we have a creator who loves us and he made us in his image, and he came to earth to live like us and die the death of a slave and rise again and inaugurate a new world which is going to be better than this one. And those are the truths that you need to undergird the things that people put on their yard signs or their bumper stickers, or even that they're waving as they walk through a pride parade, or put on a notice board at work, or whatever it is, that actually the undergirding convictions that provide the substance for those claims is Christian in nature. So basically, people around you want to believe in Christianity. They might not want to believe in some of its claims, but the ultimate humanism that undergirds what they believe comes as a Christian source. And that's wonderful news for those of us who are sharing the gospel in a post-Christian world.
That is a wonderful concluding word. Andrew, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for writing the book. And it was
thank you
really
so much
a pleasure.
for having me. Oh, it's so good to be with you. Thank you so much.